on code red types of ethical decisions, insights from the front lines, and we're very pleased to have two people who do represent different perspectives on this. So, bienvenue tout le monde à notre webinaire ce soir. J'espère que vous resterez aussi en ligne pour notre assemblée annuelle, assemblée générale annuelle. I hope that some of you will stay online also for our annual general meeting that happens right after the webinar. My name is Robert Cherney. I'm currently the chair or president of the Ethics Practitioners Association of Canada. And with me in the room are our two presenters whose names you see on the screen here, Dr. Rick Walker and Dr. Greg Brown. So just some preliminaries. You can use your phone line or the computer audio to listen in. All the voice lines are muted normally because that reduces interference. But on your panel, you can see a little symbol where you can raise your hand to request speaking privileges, or you can write messages in the question box and send them in. Give us advice. Tell us if the audio isn't coming through properly, whatever it happens to be. And you can ask questions or send in discussion items at any time. As organizer, I'll see whether it's important to interrupt the flow that one of our presenters is in the midst of at the time, or whether we'll keep them for our discussion period at the end. The presentation slides and the voice recording of this webinar will be on our website probably within about a week after the webinar. So just to let you know, I think most of you are members of the Ethics Practitioners Association of Canada, and we promote ethical practice in organizations and support practitioners across Canada by doing networking and educational opportunities like this webinar. We hope to be contributing to a world where people in organizations are ethically aware and act ethically. So what we're talking about today is the dynamics of ethical decision-making in situations of extreme pressure, because time is short, because there's possible danger to the person who has to make the decision. And these typically arise, of course, in military situations and also in policing, and those are the perspectives that we'll be hearing from today. And as you listen, I hope that you'll think about the sorts of emergency situations that your organization could face, and we'll make that part of the discussion in our last half hour. Je veux aussi signaler que nous pouvons avoir une discussion qui utilise le français aussi que l'anglais, mais nos présentateurs aujourd'hui sont des anglophones, and we will be proceeding in English with our slides and discussion. Alors, je pense que c'est le moment de vous présenter Monsieur Rick Walker, an applied ethicist who specializes in Canadian political and military culture and has taught a lot in those domains. He designed the Canadian Army's ethics program and served as an Army ethics officer with several units over a 10-year period. And over to you, Rick, to please continue our presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As Bob mentioned, my name is Rick Walker. And my aim in 20 minutes or so that I have is to apply a code red situational challenge or a construct, a category event to the management of expectations of conduct of generally frontline professionals. First of all, expectations of themselves, expectations of the professional culture that supports them, and societal expectations of the profession itself, what we inherently expect vis-a-vis conduct. In this case, I'm going to try to use the elements of the Captain Robert Semrau 2008 Canadian Armed Forces scandal, or the claim of mercy killing on the battlefield in what was essentially the summary execution of a Taliban critically wounded Taliban prisoner.
Rick, there's a problem with the, what am I?
This is what we see. We're not seeing the slides.
Well, I thought I made him the presenter.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Hit over, expand that. And show your screen. Here, there,
Okay.
that one. Okay. There. Okay.
Got it? Okay, I think we're back online here. This is great stuff. Okay, so I was talking about the Captain Semrau case, 2008. The mercy killing question on the battlefield. Essentially the summary execution of a critically wounded Taliban prisoner. Now, the whole thing imploded in the national media when he was charged with second-degree murder. Now, my aim is to expand the main teaching points associated with this case study somewhat universally if I can, and think of it in the terms of the cultures that you presently sort of have experienced. Juxtaposed against what we might call the James Forcillo, Constable James Forcillo, July 2013 shooting of the 18-year-old Sami Yatim case, again with the unique charge of second-degree murder. My thesis being is to refute the shades of gray or the conflicted moral values argument, leading to what some people would say is cognitive dissonance and some sort of ethical analysis paralysis, or perhaps a bit of the relativism where each one's moral code is basically for themselves. Frontline professionals, be they soldiers, police, medical personnel, are expected to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason. Now, I'll argue that they should know the right answer and should act, but often may not. The fact that they don't either know the right answer or don't act, on occasion, may speak volumes on how they are or are not being positioned for success. And more importantly, the nature of the overarching culture within which they are constrained in their desire to basically act as professionals. Okay. In my first section, both of these case studies, it is critical to note that had it not been for a coincidental comment by an Afghan interpreter, quote, Captain Rob Bad, boom boom Taliban, the Semrau case would never have come to light. None of the witnesses reported the event, and Captain Semrau never reported his actions. Similarly, in my view, no video for Forcillo shooting Sami Yatim, or perhaps the 4 RCMP officers who perjured themselves in the death of Robert Jukansky, they may simply have walked away as free men. So we live in a different age now of sort of documentary evidence. Having been held accountable, Corporal Fournier was forced to testify. Quote, glad the truth had come out, didn't want to be seen as the guy that ratted out the captain. Okay, now Captain Semrau had basically fired 2 rounds into the body of the critically wounded Taliban prisoner. Semrau did not testify other than the published claim that he had acted in accordance with some sort of soldier's code that apparently legitimized the concept of coup de grace responsibility for putting people out of the misery. The prosecution lit a firestorm in the media, editorial letters to the editor and so on, with the eminent Peter Worthington, for example, taking on the defense of Semrau with his Korean War experiences, whereby mercy killing was deemed to be normative conduct. Therefore, Semrau was seen by many as a victim of a politically correct witch hunt, driven by perhaps embarrassed politicians or senior generals who are responding in a CYA manner because they didn't understand real war and what happens in the field stays in the field. And if slide change.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, even the very well-respected General Lewis Mackenzie, who I used to work for, as a matter of fact, claimed that in a code red operating environment, quote, it will be his or her own moral code that will dictate the response, nothing more and nothing less. in the so-called matter of seconds, stress credibility, and in fact, in the Samrao case, having no bearing in fact, because that's not exactly the environment at all. Yet, notwithstanding the facts, what we might call the vox populi was about 70-30 in favor of Samrao. As the Army ethics officer, I tracked everything I possibly could, and if there was a straw vote, Samrao would have come away with a 70-30 advantage. Therefore, there was no Army or Canadian Armed Forces leadership statement or involvement. The idea was to let it blow over, creating, of course, huge leadership vacuum, everything being left to the courts and to the lawyers, armed with the Geneva Convention and the Canadian Armed Forces Code of Conduct, and a thoroughly confused and fractious public opinion, including all members of the Canadian Armed Forces, open for very vocal public debate. How is it possible that a senior captain, supposedly selected and trained for operations, would be deployed to Afghanistan believing in some mystical soldier's code that basically condoned the summary execution of the wounded? When Rule 1 is, wounded prisoners are offered medical treatment. When facing a supposed code red moment, Samrao was supposed to administer 2 vials of morphia and not administering 2 bullets to eliminate pain and suffering. Clearly, Samrao and others were not prepared and not positioned for success in a code red environment. And equally importantly, culturally not prepared to meet their obligations to act, to report misconduct to proper authority. Strategic and operational failures. As we take a look at some of the reasons why this may have happened, and they work for Samrao and they work for Facilo also as you transpose the different cultures. First of all, you can end up with an antithetical subgroup, a creation within an organization. They create their own loyalty. You can call it the Band of Brothers. You can call it the Blue Line, a variety of different subgroups. But what they have is a separate ethos. Notwithstanding the professed ethos of the organization, they build amongst themselves their own values and beliefs, which do not necessarily align with the professed professional ethos. Fear of reprisal is very important. Disloyalty to that subgroup, individuals are dissuaded from meeting their legal and ethical obligations to act or report, as in Corporal Fournier didn't want to be the guy that was ratting out their buddies. Third is lack of a personal mission statement, which anchors the individual. For example, a Canadian soldier may be seen as a protector and a defender who respects the dignity of all persons. No mercy killing makes them a personal stakeholder in the scene. If you have a personal mission statement, you are always a personal stakeholder wherever you are. You're not a bystander. The last one is a vacuum in leadership, or perhaps professional knowledge. The concept of if you have this vacuum, okay, it will be filled by bad people, all right, or bad ideas. Okay, we'll just move that one back a bit. Okay, right there. And of course, the failure to understand, accept, or execute the concept of duty, knowing what your duty is. All right, all of this can equal a code red failure. Much along the lines of Kant, Immanuel Kant, deontological or duty ethics and categorical imperative. The famous, what if everybody did that? Corporal Fournier, for example, turned a blind eye. Perhaps a police officer giving a brother a pass on an illegal act as a professional courtesy falls into that same category. Okay. As far as corrections go, when we look at universal systemic corrections, ethical risks, let's just go back on there. Okay, ethical risks. Any organization, the military, the police, and so on, need to establish an ethical risk assessment, focusing on their real culture, not necessarily their professed culture. you either shape the culture you want, or you inherit by default the one that you may not want. The ramifications here are huge, okay? If you think along terms of criticism of the RCMP lately, or perhaps careerist cultures in a variety of other frontline situations. Ethical leadership, for example, must be recognized and rewarded. And that's what we're going to move on to, these types of ethical decision-making. You cannot leverage a failed leadership. You can't say a few bad apples, but we got them. When you do this critical ethical risk and assessment and cultural assessment, you'll end up with some very, very serious ramifications, and very much like house cleaning at a number of different levels. You have to have a fixed and immutable ethos, professed, demonstrated, practiced, and actually lived. A code red ethical fallback position equals to an operational fallback. You have to be able to make decisions, right? And that has to provide a sort of immediate action, standard operating procedure, a drill. So military people, police people have drills that they automatically fall back on, and the same thing applies with an ethical challenge, ethical situation. Okay. You do that by inculcating the right answer in training. It becomes an operational drill. You're faced with an ethical code red situation. The secret is inculcation. You inculcate the values that you believe in that will position the frontline worker to face a code red situation. Inculcate, tricky word. To fix an idea in the mind through repetition. So in a military situation, if I say torture, you say we don't do that. And then I say, yeah, but how about if I slap them around a little bit and soften them up? You go, no, we don't do that. It's categorical. No shades of gray, ethical certainty of action, and that is what's to be tested in a code red environment. You train for each contingency, and it's often with an ethical inject. You actually do an assessment, you determine all those things that could happen, and then you determine how each one of these things you're going to work with, even to the point of including the use of lethal force. Ergo, no matter how bad the situation happens to be, you may be facing Dante's Inferno, there may be no easy ethical choices. The intention is always to act ethically in accordance with the ethos, your values, and beliefs, okay? The principle, the number one principle for the Canadian Armed Forces, and certainly the Department of National Defense is, and the Charter, to be perfectly honest, is you must respect the dignity of all persons, okay? And in that is the decision-making cycle, and of course you then have your ethos, your ethos check, which is very much culturally dependent. The same thing when it comes to making those types of decisions, the physical courage construct versus the moral courage. In this particular slide, you see the same type of standard model perception and action, but you add options and risks. And if you are suffering some cultural issues, then you find that those options and risks can become very, very inhibiting. Okay, and they are literally inhibitors. You may know the right answer, but you may not be in a position to act. Okay, so physical courage, moral courage, rules-based versus consequentialist-based. Simply the knowing the right answer is not enough. Will you act, and will you do your duty? Do you presently enjoy a healthy ethical climate that is free from reprisal, which is, in my certainly opinion, the canary in the coal mine? That's the classic indicator on the health of your existing culture. And those things progressively under review, certainly with the Public Service Disclosure Protection Act, the Canadian Forces Disclosure process, we have to take a look at those to ensure reverse onus on retaliation and ensure that we're putting people in a position where they don't have to be engaging in a risk situation, okay? The Samrow case, unfortunately, did not lead to any change. It was one of these things that was summarized by the commander of the Army as a simple case of complex matter properly handled. Before the courts, legal opinion, no change to the culture, and no obvious concerns about altering systemic failure, converting that to post-action employment. The whole thing was intended to simply blow over, and it did. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. We'll hold off on questions and comments on your presentation until after our second presentation. And who we have now is Dr. Greg Brown. You see now a summary of his experience after 33 years of police work, starting with the Ottawa City Police. Then a lot of academic work in the same area of policing, and currently continuing that academic work and providing consulting services and training to quite a few different clients interested in this area. So this will start a second perspective, and Greg, please take over. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to play a video, I think, at the end of the presentation, just to put my colleagues at ease. We're having some technological challenges. All three of us are not technical people, so we'll try to do the video at the end in the interest of time and perhaps making us a little less apprehensive about technology. So what I'm going to address in the next few minutes emerges from empirical research. I've spent about the last 3 years traveling around Canada and the United States. I did a large study. Some would suggest it's the largest data set on frontline policing in Canadian history. I spoke to 3,660 frontline police officers at 23 different police agencies. And what I was investigating is this idea of depolicing, or police officers in their present frontline work environment dealing with the issue of risk aversion and decision-making vis-a-vis that context of risk aversion. And so I'm picking up, it's working out quite well. We haven't actually done a rehearsal of this, but I'm picking up quite nicely, I think, from Rick's discussion, where he alluded to the concept of risk aversion and posed the question, will I actually do this? And so that's a decision that frontline officers are increasingly being forced to make in the context of two intertwined contemporary phenomena that I'm going to go into in a few minutes with our slides. So, Rick, if you can advance to the next slide, that would be great. So what we're talking about here, for those audience members that aren't familiar with frontline policing, in simple terms, there's two different kinds of police work that officers in today's day and age are expected to practice. We can all relate to the first one. In military or sort of governmental terms, you would call this sort of standard operating procedures. We would all be familiar with the tenets of reactive policing. So something happens, you call 911. Yes, there's somebody in my garage, they're stealing my bicycle. I've just seen a drunk driver, they're all over the road. The police are expected to respond. So the call will come on the officer's computer. The officer will respond to the call. They'll take action in response to the complainant's assertions about what's taking place. A report may be filed, somebody might get arrested. That's the traditional reactive policing that's a backbone of frontline police work. Of course, about 30 or 40 years ago, there was a decision made that purely reactive policing was not doing the trick, and there was a move towards community-based policing, which anticipates officers will engage in certain proactive behaviors in between reactive type of calls. And so in simple terms, this is discretionary policing. So an officer finishes a call, they clear themselves on their computer, they're now available for another call. But until another call comes in, we as taxpayers, as citizens in this contemporary environment, we would expect the police to be doing something with that time, other than perhaps sitting in a parking lot with a colleague drinking Starbucks and just simply waiting for the computer to beep. These would be things like traffic enforcement, checking in on suspicious neighborhoods, suspicious individuals in the neighborhood, being keenly aware of anything that triggers their suspicion that might mandate the police to become involved. So These are discretionary police activities, proactive, community-based, intelligence-led is often a term that we use now. And this is something that we would expect officers to do on a discretionary basis with their time. In this regard, I would suggest, I've only worked really in my whole adult life in one field, or two fields, policing and academia. I think this is somewhat unique in policing, and I think it's differentiated somewhat from Rick's discussion around the military. I'm not sure there's a tremendous amount of discretion on a battlefield as there is with frontline policing. So the two case studies we're doing today, I think, are very interesting in that they're different, but yet somewhat similar. If we could advance to the next slide, Rick, thank you. So what we're going to talk about here is sort of non-standard operating procedures in frontline police work. So yes, there are some sort of expectations. I was a supervisor. I led a platoon of officers in downtown Ottawa, and my expectation of my officers was that they would embrace the, to use Rick's terminology, the organizational ethos that we would want our officers to practice proactive policing in their discretionary time. That's the organizational expectation. That was my expectation. How do you translate that into behavior? That's the challenge. You have to consider the ratio of supervisors on the road to frontline officers, which quite often, with considerations today around budget restraints and doing more with less, sometimes that ratio can be as high as 20 sergeants, one sergeant for 20 constables. Very challenging to monitor what your officers are doing in their non-call time or their discretionary time. Very, very challenging, I would suggest impossible today, to jump into somebody else's mind and figure out, did they actually see that suspicious person, or were they looking the other direction? Why did they elect not to respond to the stimuli of a suspicious event? Why did they just drive by? And so this is a very challenging area, because there are no mechanisms, certainly that I'm aware of, to discourage, formally or informally, de-policing behaviors. And as we're going to discuss, once the de-policing sort of philosophy gets entrenched in the organizational subculture, it becomes very challenging to try to monitor it, address it, and remedy it. Next slide, please, Ray. So this is just a screen grab from the video that I will probably play towards the end of the presentation. It's from a popular media show, South Park, that several years ago actually did a humorous, anecdotal sort of analysis of de-policing. As you can see, this is towards the end of the video, and essentially the entire police department becomes disappointed with an event, and they essentially go on strike. So they actually turn the police department into a hula school, and they don't respond to calls from the public for anything other than complete emergencies. Next slide, please. And so the two sort of phenomenon that I suggest have led to the prevalence of de-policing, and we'll get into some of the empirical numbers in a few minutes, are two intertwined phenomenon. The first one being today's technosocial visibility. I think Rick referenced it as a different era of visibility in a military context. There was no cameras generally, I don't believe, on the battlefield. I've never been a soldier, but I think they're quite rare unless somebody invites CNN to come along for a ride, which I think the Americans have stopped doing, judging from my review of popular media on that. But there's generally no cameras on a battlefield. In policing, it's much different, of course. There's cameras everywhere. I'm sure the building we're in right now has CCTV cameras on the outside, probably some on the inside. Of course, we all have smartphones with video capabilities. My wife just upgraded to the iPhone, whatever they're up to now, 10 or something, which apparently has a way better camera than my eldest son's super professional photography cameras. These tools of visibility are everywhere where police do their work. And of course, my colleague Rick has alluded to the two cases, Jaganski, which I call in the next slide sort of the Canada's, if you could advance to the next slide, Rick, that'd be great. This is Jaganski, I equate to as Canada's Rodney King moment. So on the left, we have Mr. King being struck by members of the Los Angeles Police Department. On the right, we have 4 members of the RCMP subduing Mr. Jaganski, and of course, he passed away as a result of this. And my colleague referenced also the Yatim incident in Toronto, where there was not only video from CCTV, from in the streetcar, from citizens observing this dynamic event. So visibility today is omnipresent in frontline police environments. Next slide, please. And so I addressed this in an empirical study some years ago. The article emerging from that study was published in the British Journal of Criminology. The reference is on the slide for you. If any of you wish to delve into this in a little bit more detail, please feel free to do so. The general takeaway from that study was that police are in a ubiquitous visibility circumstance today. Some academics previously would suggest policing was essentially invisible. That research was done in the 80s and 90s. Today, I would advance that I believe frontline police officers are the most visible entity in society today. Doctors, lawyers, judges, bus drivers, nurses, you name it, they don't have the kind of visibility where they do their work that the police do. And of course, the police are distinguished intentionally. They wear a uniform, they drive cars that are flashy with lights and sirens on them. So there's really essentially no hiding for frontline officers anymore. Next slide, please, sir. So the second phenomenon that dovetails in with this depolicing theory is there's a much more intensified societal engagement with policing today. And I'm not privy to how old the audience members are, but some of you may remember where the general public, this is a very broad statement, but the general public is acknowledged in the academic community in the past as sort of turning a blind eye to police, which would include some instances of police misconduct. The general sort of position that I take on this, I started walking the beat in Vanier in 1985, and the public was not particularly concerned with how I policed their neighborhood. They just wanted issues in the neighborhood addressed. And so the general idea was police know what they're doing, they know the people they deal with, they know what they have to do to deal with them, and we'll just leave it up to them to do what they have to do. Few would think that that's the way things are today, I would suspect. Next slide, please. And so this is just a image from CNN. Their legal commentator, the third person from the left, Sonny Hopkins, is holding up a sign saying, "I can't breathe." This is in response to the incident with Eric Garner on Staten Island. So there's a new, as the title in the slide says, there is a new socio-political landscape for frontline police work today. Much more criticism, much more visibility. Next slide, please, sir. And so, of course, I'm not a physicist, but there's a phrase that goes something like, for every action, there's an opposite reaction or something similar. So, of course, if the public is more critical of the police, there's more scrutiny, there's more visibility, there's going to be a reaction amongst the police themselves. And so you can see some of the frontline sentiment here in a sort of a somewhat humorous way. I include the slide on the right. Officers are feeling somewhat, some academics in the United States context particularly are saying officers are feeling somewhat under attack in this new environment. And so, of course, there's a response. So on the left, the NYPD, don't like us, don't call us. That's a similar, that's a sort of broad emotion that I hear from thousands and thousands of frontline officers. Next slide, please, sir. So this is a really good demonstration. It happened fortuitously a couple of weeks ago, as you can see in May. So the Civilian Oversight Agency that monitors the New York Police Department is doing a play on the American the President's Day thing, the 4th of May, and the Star Wars sort of thing around that, may the force be with you type of thing. And they write, of course, may the 4th Amendment protect you from unreasonable searches and seizures, and if you feel your rights have been violated by an NYPD officer, file a complaint. The Sergeants Benevolent Association, which is the second Twitter post, which represents about 16,000 NYPD officers, responds with what you can all read. You're all a disgrace. You sit on your ass and target the NYPD, all while growing up on the nipple of what's easy. So a very sort of controversial response, but illustrative of the general sentiment across frontline policing. Next slide, please, sir. And so Ray Kelly, the retired former commissioner of the NYPD, has endorsed this idea that the police are risk averse. They're more reluctant to respond. And there's quite a bit of support from within policing, from within governance. I spent the last 6 or so months traveling all over Canada and the US doing presentations on this. And I'm hearing anecdotally from chiefs almost unanimously, yeah, this is something that is happening today. We're very concerned about it and very good for my consulting business. How do we fix this? Next slide, please. So perhaps the most noteworthy to date is Jim Comey, who's usually in the news for other reasons, but back in 2015, he did a speech at the University of Chicago Law School where he endorsed this idea that depolicing, or officers intentionally disengaging from certain proactive behaviors, ignoring certain types of situations intentionally, he espoused that this is something that is actually prevalent, and he's picking up on it. So you can read for yourself, but as he says, I spoke to officers privately in one big city precinct. They told me, quote, "We feel like we're under siege and we don't feel much like getting out of our cars." This is a phenomenon that he triggered. Other law enforcement officials across the United States have publicly endorsed his position, including the director of the Drug Enforcement Administration, many large city chiefs. So this is a big issue. Nobody measured it empirically, so I decided I would do so. So next slide, please. I'll present a couple of slides that show the empirical results of the data. So Comey was dismissed by the Obama administration as this is an anecdotal analysis of something. There's no empirical evidence of this. I had some generous funding from the Fulbright Institute and the Government of Canada to do an empirical study to see, is this really happening or is this just somebody's opinion? So as I said, the sample size was 3,660. And what I was drilling into, it's a very large survey. It asked a lot of questions, but the three key questions that are presented in these slides relate to behavior. So sometimes, as we all appreciate, talk is different than actual behavior. So what I was trying to measure is, have officers actually changed their behavior in response to these two phenomena: visibility, increased societal engagement. So this slide talks about behavior modifications because of increased video recording. As you can see, over 50% of officers say, yes, I've changed behaviors because of my increased visibility. We can get into this more in the questions. The next slide, please, relates to, of course, behavioral modifications due to the uptick in public critique, demands for more scrutiny, demands for more accountability. Similarly, 58% of officers says, yes, I have changed my behavior from what I used to do because of this new environment today. The next slide, please. So what I tried to interrogate, because of course spending over a year in the United States dealing with policing issues, race is a very big issue in any American context. Not quite to the same extent in Canada, but we do have issues around race, gender, sexual orientation, mental health challenges, physical disabilities. So I asked officers, is there some particular characteristic in the population you deal with in your frontline police work that causes you increased concern and risk aversion? So are you concerned that there's an elevated level of public criticism or the filing of a complaint against you because of a characteristic amongst the people that you deal with? And so 40% of the entire sample, or 48% of the officers that answered yes, which amounted to 85% of the total sample, said yes, there is a specific characteristic or group of characteristics that we think present an elevated risk to us. Of course, race was almost universal. Even amongst non-depolicers, 95% of officers said, I perceive there's a risk when I deal with somebody who represents or presents as a visible minority. Next slide, please. And so what this all amounts to in a nutshell is the idea of risk aversion impacting on frontline officers' behavior. In Canada, the terminology is often referenced as FIDO, or pardon my language, but fuck it, drive on. There's some other acronyms that have come to my attention. FART, first available right turn. If you see something happening, you take the first available right turn and ignore it. The book that I'm writing for Oxford right now is titled To Swerve and Neglect. I have to give credit. That came from the chief of the Mesa, Arizona police. After I did a presentation out there, he walked over and said, oh, Greg, we have this happening out here, but we don't call it FIDO or FART or one of those things. Out here, we call it To Swerve and Neglect, which is a play on the police motto of to serve and protect. Dan Axford, who thinks it's quite funny that I use his Twitter post in my slide, he's a retired London, Ontario police officer who's the president of their police labor group, and he was actually the president of the Ontario Police Association, so the labor group that represents all police officers. Quite a veteran officer, pretty switched on in the political context. This is what he has on his Twitter feed. So happy to be retired. The best advice to other officers is FIDO. So to practice this notion of depolicing. Next slide, please, sir. So what I discovered from the data was that depolicing essentially exists on a continuum. And so in response to those 3 behavior questions I referenced earlier, I've classified officers as belonging to one of 4 groups. So if you answered 0 out of 3, you're a non-depolicer. So none of these things influence any change in your behavior. Visibility, public criticism, characteristics of the people you deal with, that's irrelevant to you as an officer. You're going to do the job the way you always have. 1 out of the 3 makes you a limited depolicer, 2 out of the 3 moderate. If you've answered 3 out of the 3, you're part of the 30% of frontline officers that are intensive depolicers. In simple terms, you are responding when the computer beeps. You drive to the call at the speed limit and you do the minimum of what's required of you as a police officer. You're not practicing any proactive or discretionary police work. When chiefs see this slide, they all look at each other and they sort of gasp, and then they come up to me afterwards and say, yeah, I think you're bang on. I think the data is exactly correct. This is what I've been perceiving for the last several years in my organization. Next slide, please. So just in sort of wrapping things up here, I just presented a couple of examples of evidence. I have a whole chapter dealing with corroboration of the study's finding. Bruce Chapman, the current president of the Police Association of Ontario, we were on Ontario Today together. And after I talked about what I was finding, he said the same thing. Peter Kirkham, who's kind of the UK's version of the public safety commentator that we have on the news, similarly said, my research is accurate, and he's suggesting somebody do it in the UK, which a couple of my colleagues in Wales, I think, are going to start in the fall. Next slide, please. Through some Freedom of Information requests to a bunch of different police agencies, I've documented that this phenomenon is not just anecdotal, it's not just officers saying things, the behavior is actually coming through officially. So this is Ottawa Police self-initiated calls. You can see the downward trajectory of the graph. Next slide, please. Very similar, Calgary Police, same thing. I could present more slides, Halifax, Winnipeg, Vancouver, Rochester, Yonkers, New York, all the same downward trajectory of the slide. So in sort of wrapping things up at this particular stage, our moderator asked me to sort of end on a bit more of a positive note. This is depressing. Our police officers are not doing what we told them to do. I do have some solutions. So our next slide, please. So these are ideas I can't give myself credit for. They're more stolen from informal focus groups I've had with chiefs, with police trainers, with police officers. It's a couple of things I think we can do to address this. And so the first thing is to figure out this is happening. And so my research has clearly demonstrated it's happening. So how do we deal with this? The first thing we have to do is screening through recruitment. So somebody has to do some studies to identify what makes a potential officer susceptible to depolicing. How can we increase our numbers of non-depolicers versus intensive depolicers? What are the characteristics of those officers? And how do we hire them and train them? So that's number one. The second issue is we can't have intensive depolicers or officers that subscribe to this ethos of depolicing as our police academy instructors, as our in-service trainer, or as our field training officers. You can get the best training at the Ontario Police College, any police college, military college. I'm sure this transcends any kind of educational institution, but it's useless if the person comes back into the work environment and the first thing they're told is, look, forget everything you learned there. This is the way we do things here. In this context, we practice depolicing. We can't have that happening. The third component is we have to discuss this openly and honestly. And so many progressive chiefs are saying, yeah, this is happening. Thank you for demonstrating it empirically. Let's talk about it. Let's address it. So get the head out of the sand. Fourth idea is the command staff has to demonstrate this. And I think my colleague talked about this. You have to actually practice what you're preaching. And so the command staff has to demonstrate tangibly through their actions, not just their words, an up-to-date understanding of their frontline police environment. Many of you will appreciate this. As you succeed through the ranks in policing, you become disengaged from where you came from. In some chiefs' case, they haven't been on the front lines for over 30 years. So how are they actually in touch with what the new environment is vis-a-vis visibility, public criticism? They're just out of touch. So you've got to find a way to show the frontline officers that are out there doing a very challenging job, I actually know what's going on tangibly. And of course, the last thing is policing, military, other organizations suffer from a crisis in morale. So Deloitte's done some work that talks about the disengaged employee. Morale is a monstrous issue across any organization today. And so how do you improve morale? And my idea is you have to, and certainly in the policing context, you have to accept or embrace a default position supportive of the officers. There's nothing frontline officers hate worse than when a controversial video shows up on the news. You know, there's always two sides to every story. Things are, especially video, is often lacking a very important context. Nothing worse than having a chief of police 12 minutes later convening a press conference and throwing the police under the bus. That will just drive morale right into the toilet. Officers hate it. It leads to a divide between the command staff and the actual worker bees on the front line. And so my position and what I counsel my clients in policing to do is just, there's no harm in adopting a default position of support. The video looks troubling. There's two sides to every story. I'm going to wait until I get more context, till I hear the second side before I condemn my officer. I'm keeping an open mind. I'm not saying police misconduct doesn't happen, but until I have some evidence, I have my officers' backs. They love that. And the chiefs that embrace that advice generally do extremely well vis-a-vis morale. And on that note, I will end. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to some questions. And thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Greg.
We won't do the video. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg, and Rick as well. Let's leave this slide up for a moment because I think that it may stimulate some questions. One of our audience members has sent in a question. I'll read it in its original and then I'll translate. Est-il possible d'être un gestionnaire éthique, ethical leadership, dans une organisation qui ne l'est pas vraiment? Is it possible to be an ethical leader in an organization that's not really ethical? And I think that's an appropriate question. At a meta level, I think I would ask both Greg and Rick, have you presented outside of your particular fields of policing and of military and talked to organizations with other kinds of mandates and generalized from the lessons that you've learned, because that's in fact our context here with EPAC. You're talking to people who are not in your own particular fields and trying to draw lessons from it. So when you talk more generally, and you just talked, Greg, now about the general phenomenon of morale, what do other people pick up from what you say, and what lessons do you get? And please refer back to our question here is about being an ethical leader in an organization that's really not exactly ethical itself.
I'll answer that in two parts. So first of all, yes, you can be an ethical leader in an unethical organization. It's probably a very uncomfortable position, but I see it all the time. Command staff in policing take a lot of courses on police ethics. I've actually lectured on some of those courses. So they're sort of topped right up on the ethics, or at least the idea of ethical behavior, ethical decision making. Whereas some of the frontline officers maybe don't embrace that particular ethos. So you can exist. I would suggest that it's incumbent on those kind of leaders in those situations to try to bring up the ethics of the frontline officers. And so certainly in a couple of contexts, I've been brought in to do some work with frontline officers trying to close that gap. So it does exist. It can be addressed, I think. A lot of it relates to what's on the slide. The command staff has to demonstrate that they care about the frontline workers. If they're asking them to raise their ethical standards and curb unethical behavior, they have to walk the walk. The second aspect, transitioning to other fields, I've applied this in the academic field as well. And so David Bailey, who's a notable policing scholar internationally, very nice man, he actually wrote a very kind of humorous paper, very short, comparing the academic world to the policing world and sort of poking fun at the academics that like to sit in the ivory tower and make fun of the police. And he pointed out that a lot of the critiques of police actually would apply even more profoundly in the academic context. And so these ideas, I think Rick and I have demonstrated, are certainly prevalent in military police, but they transcend essentially all organizations. And so I've seen this in the academic world as well, where you have these kind of issues where there's a disconnect between the ethos being subscribed to at the top or at the command staff or administrative staff, senior leadership staff, and how that translates into the worker bees. So in the academic context, universities can have the greatest ideas, but if they don't translate down to the professor level, communicated to the students, then you have that tremendous disconnect. And so I think both Rick and my sort of findings and ideas translate essentially, I would think, to almost every organization.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think it's brilliant because it's optimistic. It's ethical leaders within an ethically challenged organization. There's not really sort of an unethical organization. These suffer ethical challenges, and those challenges can be systemic, they can be career-based, there could be a variety of them. So the answer is yes, you can. And again, it's more positive than negative. In no particular order, it's incident dependent. Okay, so a very ethical leader who is taking care of subordinates and in a way taking one for the team or dealing with them in a very ethical manner I'd like to think common, not necessarily. They're there. Okay, you're always going to get those types of people. So it's incident dependent. There's an event, and the leader steps up and does the right thing at the right time for the right reason, and has the positive group effect. So this is great. Okay, it's also based on levels of leadership. So if you have an ethically challenged organization, some of these corporate structures, the entire Canadian Armed Forces, get the idea, the Army or whatever it may be, they're very, very large. And your leadership is at all levels. So even at the very lowest leader to subordinate relationship, you can stay under the radar and literally be, as we talked about earlier, a fully fledged transformational leader that will inspire subordinates, and they will be just like you. So, and this is great for the organization. And to be perfectly honest, I credit that with most of these incredible performances that the Canadian Armed Forces does. You can, pick holes in different cultural systemic issues, but Corporal Bloggins, on behalf of a couple of privates making it happen, being the quintessential transformational leader, ethical up the hoop, wins accolades, okay? And this converts people, and they become role models. They become I want to be just like Sergeant Bloggins or Warrant Officer Smith. I want to be like him, okay? So it's dependent on levels, because as you rise in rank, there's a systemic issue. At what point are you no longer below the radar, where you're in control of your own destiny, and whatever the nefarious forces within the system, they start to impact upon you. So in a way, unfortunate, as you stay with those ethical principles and rise, there's sort of maybe an ethical Peter principle here, that you get to the highest level before the system reacts against you, okay? That, yes, you're ethical, but we're not. We don't like you, and this is an nepotistic system. So all of a sudden, your career can grind to a halt, and you retire with dignity intact, and everybody loves you, and you've been a wonderful ethical leader, but sorry, a minimum pension, and you don't rise up. So in a nutshell, I think it's incident dependent. I think it's a question of leader at all levels, and I think that conceivably there's a point where when your leadership starts to run into corporate cultural issues, then you can pay a price for being an ethical leader within an ethically challenged environment.
Can I just address one point that emerges that I think may be illuminating for the organization, the people from the organization that are listening from different organizations. So I can speak authoritatively from a policing context, and I would challenge the listeners, where does your organization invest their ethical resources? And so I know in the policing context, senior managers, chiefs, deputy chiefs, superintendents, get extensive ethics training. They hire people like my consulting firm to come in and deliver workshops. They go to the FBI Academy. They attend a lot of things around ethical decision making. And so the ethical or ethically challenged, as my colleague, I like that term, pointed out, of a chief would relate to, how are you spending your budget? How are you making these decisions about personnel allocations? Are they ethical? I would challenge you to consider how much ethical resources are being spent where the behavior is very, very, it can have much more severe consequences than in the boardroom of a chief's office. So on a street corner of Yonge and Bloor with a constable, or on the battlefield in Afghanistan with a frontline private, are they getting any ethics training? Is ethics at that level essentially lip service? And so I don't have the answer to this. Somebody could certainly, I think, look this up. How much ethical training does a constable get versus that chief get? In my experience, it would be, by a margin of 100 to 1. We used to run in the Ottawa Police an ethics workshop. I usually spoke on that every year. That was canceled about 3 years ago. And so the frontline officers, and generally in attendance were all of the senior officers and staff sergeants and sergeants that want to get promoted, almost no constables. And so I think I would look introspectively within your own organization, are the leaders getting all this top level gold standard ethics training, but the workers where the ethical decision making or the code red can be very, very problematic. What are they getting in terms of decision making and ethics and going through these kind of things?
That sounds really weird to me, because the problems, the incidents that Rick has talked about, they don't arise in the boardroom; they arise at the street corner.
Right.
And so then my Pollyanna observation would be that there's a belief that if the chief and the superintendents get the training, then it's going to trickle down. They'll achieve something there. My cynical response is that they get that much training because the objective is actually spin.
Right.
That there's an acceptance that incidents will arise, and they want to make sure that the chief and the other spokespeople are well equipped to give a publicly acceptable account. Unfortunately, you're agreeing, Greg.
I am, and I don't want to out myself as a hypocrite, but I have very few clients that are constables. I have a lot of clients that are chiefs, and so I try my best to endorse in those relationships. How about if we deliver some training to your frontline officers where the decisions can be very problematic? If you make an ethically challenged decision as a chief, it could have some consequences financially or politically. If you make a problematic decision as a constable, it can result in officers being charged with murder, cities being burnt with riots and different issues like that. So I was nodding in agreement. I think we might want to just I'm intrigued to hear what my colleague Rick has to say, but I think maybe as an organization, you might want to take a step back and just think, this is all great, but are we delivering it where it should be delivered? I mean, I'm not saying take away from the training or the discussion in the upper echelons, but are we neglecting where this can really have some serious problematic consequences?
It's a famous, you're both right. Dealing with healthy skepticism as compared to cynicism. I think Greg has got a very serious point because, and with a certain skepticism, not cynicism, senior leadership tends to be the focal point so that organizations, let's say government, can say, these people received the training and now it's happened on their watch and we can burn it. Okay, got it, all right? Which is the gold standard because that's what happens at senior leadership. They get the Porsche and so on and so on. but that's on the receiving end of leadership. Now, what leadership does with it, you see, because this is ethical leadership, it's not just ethics, it's, are you an ethical leader? It goes back to our first point. So in a way, notwithstanding their tick-in-the-box qualification at the corporate level, what are leaders doing with what Bob referred to as the trickle-down factor? So, you know, if a commanding officer of 1,000 persons stands up in front of his people on deployment or on a holiday or a regimental day or something, and basically communicates their personal expectations of your conduct. This is what we believe in, okay? This is what I expect of you. Now, it could be the senior NCOs, it can be the officers, or a parade square full of thousands of people. And 1,000 heads all go, oui, je comprends, I understand. Well, that's communicating the leadership, okay? And that's the reinforcement. That's the sort of stuff that shapes a culture. Putting up a poster or saying we ran a special day, you know, tick in the box, and no, you have to live it. So you personify it. And of course, with that, it, like military justice, or I'd like to think civil justice, must be seen to take place. So if someone transgresses that, it's quite clear that they're censured for this. Okay, I'm not going to be like Bob, that was bad. And then all of a sudden, Greg does something incredibly ethical and demonstrates his leadership and gets rewarded for it. So if someone created a corporate structure that rewarded and recognized and advanced and promoted the values that the organization believes in, then I want to be like those guys, okay? And if the organization does not, if you are an ethical leader and you're punished for doing that, and the thing compresses on you and it reacts badly to you, and you know, and there's a cover up, you get the idea, we've seen all this before, then that's the lesson too. I'm not going to do that, okay? So that guy did the right thing at the right time for the right reason and got crushed. Not a good idea. So the trickle-down factor is assumed because it's the leadership factor. It just happens to be ethics. I'd like to think that policing specialties would do exactly the same thing. So a very sophisticated police leadership would be trickling down the same technical expertise. Here are my expectations of you in a 21st century sensitized environment that Greg alluded to, okay? And here's how I expect you to respond. And I think that's the attitude that goes to your last slide of positivism. This is how you start to shape the culture that you want, not the one you get by default or osmosis, okay?
We've had a follow-up question, which I'll read. 100% d'accord avec l'importance de former le personnel sur la première ligne. Quelle serait, selon vous, la première chose à leur enseigner, la première compétence à leur transmettre? 100% in agreement with the importance of training the front line, the première ligne, that's front line. Personnel. What would be the first thing, according to you, that ought to be that ought to be taught? The first competence that they ought to be trained in. So the front line, what's the first thing?
Well, I mean, thinking very quickly on the fly, I think that if I was going to address this in a step-by-step, thank you for the question. I would first suggest that rather than rushing into the front line with a program, I think the first thing you have to do is change the environment. If there's a problematic environment, if there are ethically challenged environment. So going back to what's in that last slide, I think you have to develop an organizational environment that is conducive to addressing the issue of ethical decision-making or ethical behaviors at the front line. It's essentially going to fall on deaf ears if this is sort of from on high, I think is the general terminology. You know, if senior management comes in with a program to try to address some of these issues, and it's looked on as, okay, well, you know, they don't actually do this, and they're just doing this because it's politically correct and maybe to advance their their careers. So I think you would have to practice what you preach, demonstrate that tangibly, let the subordinates or let the worker bees see that you're actually believing in this concept, have some tangible demonstrations of it. I mean, just anecdotally, I mean, one of the advice that I give, and I think it's happening quite often now, fortunately. As I said, sometimes chiefs will be off the front lines, or senior management of organizations will be away from the front lines for decades and decades. Not sounding cynical, but positively skeptical. When I challenge some chiefs about, how are you understanding what's happening in the frontline environment? How do you know? Like, you've never been to a frontline parade. In Rick's context, you've never been amongst a platoon deployed in the field. You're getting these through news releases or memos. So how do you stay in touch? So I advocate for senior leadership. They find time to go to conferences and do all kinds of other things. I say, just maybe one shift every month or two. Show up on a parade or a shift briefing in a constable's uniform, so missing all the gold on the epaulettes and all the fancy accoutrement with the uniform. Show up in a constable's uniform, understand how to do the constable's job. When I transferred from homicide to frontline patrol, it took me 3 days to learn how to turn on the cruiser, how to work the computer, how to do a report. But the essence of police work, I'm sure the essence of infantry work and military, the essence of whatever it is in your organization that is your frontline work, that never changes. And so what I advocate is chiefs to actually go and do a shift, like not as a ride along, but actually do the job. So you actually take calls, arrest people, do reports, deal with the public. Then you really do understand the frontline environment because you're actually in it and you understand how it's changed and what's happening today. So I would advocate, in response to the question, clean up that part first. Get your leadership on board, get them up to date, understanding what's going on. As Rick said, demonstrating that ethical leadership, modeling the behavior you want. That will increase the respect you get. That'll increase your morale. And then you can deliver down to the front lines. This is what we're doing. This is our expectation of you. We're giving you some training, some counsel in changing your behaviors where there is behavioral issues. And then I think it'll be much more effective. In my experience, trotting out a program with a lot of fanfare that's going to fall on deaf ears is essentially a waste of your organization's money. Modeling it to leadership, letting the worker bee see it, and then delivering them a product that's consistent. It's my advice.
Well, a great question, what do you do first? I think in a way you have to think at different levels. And because what we're really talking about is your corporate mission, whatever your corporate mission happens to be. And I believe everything's connected. It doesn't have to be police, it doesn't have to be the military. Whatever corporate structure you have, you will inevitably have a strategic contribution. You'll have an operational level contribution. You'll have a tactical level contribution. And they may, in truth, be vertical, but again, they're all interconnected. So ensuring at the strategic level, whatever the highest level of leadership you've got, is that you have a corporate ethos that is clearly articulated and certain. So what are your corporate values and beliefs? We believe in the following. Got it. Whatever they happen to be, simple, complex, so be it. Now, they have to be clearly articulated to what I might call the operational level, because you're moving now from the concept to the what. So who are we? What do we believe in? And how will we know if we succeed? So that's kind of your middle management, senior leadership. I call it the operational level. Okay. And then that has to be communicated to what we might call the great proletariat masses, the worker bees, the people who make contact with the mission. First of all, they have to believe in all these levels. Okay, they have to have the trust, the inherent trust. I think the term is, have your back. Fair enough, that's a vernacular. But they have to believe that they're part of a greater whole, and that they're major contribution. At that level, it's a technical level. How do you do it? How do you transfer an ethical construct to an operational directive to dealing with these people? Okay, and in a military context, often it must be training specific because your challenges keep changing. All right, particularly particularly in a 21st century asymmetrical environment. Now, Greg was talking about the asymmetry of a social construct, constantly changing. Okay, hybrid, asymmetrical policing world. Well, the same thing happens globally in a military context. So your trainers, that how do you transfer these values and beliefs at the tactical level, training specific to meet fully supported challenges. So some of the things I want to identify, you, as best you can, you hit every contingency possible. What happens on patrol if you run into a child slave market, right? What does Corporal Bannister do then? Do you see what I mean? Well, if you've anticipated that world and you've prepared these people in advance, they are positioned for operational success. They don't sit there going, you know, duh, what do I do now, or suffer some sort of cognitive dissonance, all right? And all of a sudden they act in accordance with those values and beliefs all the way up. And in fact, you know, it's difficult to press this one, but this number one principle, certainly in the Government of Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces, Defense Ethics Program, Code of Values, respect the dignity of all persons. If the lowest ranking person found themselves in the middle of Dante's Inferno, had no idea what the perfect answer was, and simply said, never mind the consequences, I acted, my intention was to respect the dignity of all persons, you could ask for nothing better, okay? But that started with the same belief and the clarity at the strategic level. They didn't make it up at the bottom, but I can guarantee you this, if that is not provided and is a void or a vacuum, as I keep saying, nature of operations, like Mother Nature, abhors a vacuum, someone is going to fill it. And if you need endless Abu Ghraib prison disaster, the Haditha massacres, you can just keep going back, and it's always follow the vacuum. There was a leadership ethical vacuum, bad people filled it, and bad things happened.
Thank you. I'd like to make a quick observation from my own experience and then ask a completely different kind of question. I was on a study tour in the early 80s looking at the ways that that other institutions outside government were using new technologies in training. And we visited one of the largest American insurance companies, and they had invested in a Hollywood quality series, you know, like a sitcom. And so they developed a set of characters who were the people working in the firm, along with their family and their supervisor and so forth, and then it showed them in different situations. And we were told that this all went over very well because they were extremely well made. They were fun to watch. But these then became the culture, became the ethos of the firm, to use your terms, Rick, because people started saying, oh well, you know, yesterday I had to deal with blah blah blah, so I found myself thinking about that character George. I tried to do it the way George would do it. Donna would have done this, and that seemed to fit the situation. And what occurred to me listening to the two of you now is that was a means that they used, which was not haphazard, because it could be broadcast to everybody. It could be made an easy, enjoyable part of everybody's training, and it clearly had the endorsement of every level of the organization. Because you're not going to commit yourself that way and run the risk of saying, yeah, I was only kidding. You can't. It's like watching the ad on the newspaper where the claim is made that the personnel of this airline are so caring because they're co-owners. Well, then when that airline screws up, boy, everybody knows about it. So the owners at every level, not just the front line, better be prepared to be consistent with it. So that's my quick observation. And now I'd like to pose a question quite different from those. I'll get back nos amis qui ont posé des questions en français. Je vais retourner à vos questions. But not that long ago, there was the Officer Kenny Lamb situation in Toronto, where the unbalanced individual drove the van down the sidewalks of Yonge Street and killed a lot of people. And then we had that scene of the officer confronting the individual and bringing it to a successful conclusion without firing shots. And I wanted to ask the two of you to clarify what you saw going on in that, and whether this had to do with standard operating procedures, or whether it had to do with discretion, or whether it had to do with cognitive issues, or what have you. Maybe I'll start with you, Greg, because you're the policeman and you know this world rather well.
Of course, for sure. So that situation was very informative, and I found it to be intriguing, having been involved in somewhat of a similar incident personally. So, I mean, first of all, you know, I was broadly across media applauding the officer's actions. I think the officer did a fantastic job. I think, fortunately, for whatever reason, I mean, we discussed it earlier off camera, you know, whether it was daylight, the officer's perspective, he was relatively close. He had the visual acuity to be able to obviously discern that the object in the person's hands was not a weapon. And in those circumstances, he responded, in my opinion, as somebody that's trained in use of force, textbook. The fact that he was able to holster his pistol and go to the ASP expandable baton in case there was going to be a hand-to-hand fight situation, that was absolutely perfect. And so I think the officer's training, I mean, Mark Saunders, the chief of Toronto Police, attributed this to officers' training. I go through use of force training. I'm part of an empirical study right now where I actually attend use of force training sessions around Ontario. And so officers are being trained in de-escalation and how to deal with these kind of situations. So I think this was perfect. Always with the caveat or the asterisk that we shouldn't expect this to always be the resolution of an occurrence like this. You know, there are going to be circumstances where police, certainly military, where you're expected to use force that is likely going to be lethal or cause grievous bodily harm to someone. And so I would hate the expectation to be that every police officer everywhere would be able to handle these situations. If the officer wasn't able to quickly discern that it was a cell phone or a wallet, it probably would have been appropriate. And this is where, Bob, to get to your component of discretion, there was some discretion in that circumstance. I think very few people, just from sort of an informal pub type of discussion with a focus group with people, very few Canadians would have been appalled if that officer would have shot that person. With all of the things going on, you know, he murdered 10 people, or however many people, a lot of people. The dynamicness of the situation, I mean, highly dynamic. You're confronting somebody who's trying to apparently get you to shoot him with his behavior. I think the public would have said, well, the officer, you know, he made a mistake. The guy didn't actually have a weapon, but under the circumstances, you know, all the things happening, we would accept that the officer shot the person. And so there was an element of discretion there, and I think it speaks volumes to the kind of training that the police get. Police are, I think my colleague Rick mentioned this earlier, around training each potential situation. We do a lot of training with scenario-based events so that officers are experiencing it in reality. And so we use almost like paintball cartridges, but they actually hurt quite a bit. I was actually hit in the arm and it broke the skin and it hurt a lot. So it brings that realism to it. And officers, I know certainly in my experience, I was a big buy-in person. When somebody gets out of a car and they're firing an AR-15 at you, shooting these paint things that hurt at you, you get right into the moment. And so you've actually practiced these very dynamic, potentially extremely controversial, ethically challenging scenarios over and over again. And so it becomes somewhat muscle memory when it's the real world. And certainly in my shooting incident, I had to do very little thinking and a lot of reacting based on my training. And what I did was completely found to be totally ethical, totally the right decision making. And so training, I think, is a key component here.
Okay, right. Not being a policeman, but simply trying to follow some of the key elements of these courses. First of all, I'd like to point out, I think there's a Toronto issue here. I think you have a Toronto contrast issue. Toronto is important, okay? And it's a center of gravity issue. So Toronto is important to center of gravity because you have a contrast here. So on the downside, you have the Forcillo case. And that lingers. Nobody forgets that one, comes up all the time. So you have the judge who determines that Constable Jim Forcillo failed his training. He failed his training. Okay. You have this other thing, which I refer to, though, as leadership training failure, because in the testimony, Forcillo identifies his job is to win the engagement. Okay, the policeman's job is to win the engagement. Well, wait a second, that's like a military maximum force. No, it's the reverse. Why, first of all, why is he the principal agent with the gun, surrounded by about 6 other, perhaps more senior policemen in the video? Okay, he's the guy determining if he shoots or not. You know, it's not a group effort. He wasn't given orders to shoot. Okay, so you have a leadership issue going on there, which, interesting enough, shifts from a second-degree murder situation with the first 2 or 3 rounds and to an attempted murder with the other 6 that he puts into a prostrate body. So this is a really black eye issue. This is painful. Okay, nothing's good about this. In the midst of this world stage event, this terrorist phenomenon, you get a policeman, product of the same type of training, who, I know it sounds odd, meets standard. He meets expectation and standard, but he does it on the world stage. So we all gasp a little bit and say, boy, that he did what he was trained to do, okay? And we should not be shocked by this. And in fact, we should be a little embarrassed if we turn around and said, well, he should have done somehow more. As in, that's a guilty guy, you know, along with the Forcillo thing, he should have tried to win that engagement. Now, he would only do that if he needed to do that, okay? So he actually met standard on the world stage. So it's upbeat and it's very positive, and we think this is great, and it reinforces the training model, okay? Because if Kenny Land, you know, just a bumpkin guy until he arrived on the day, he happened to be the guy, could have been anybody, you know, read the situation, met his standards of expectations and training. And it just happens to be on a rather big occasion.
Go to the next slide, please. We don't have much time left, and I would like to, oopsie, here we go. I would like to invite people to raise their hand, and I'll allow you to join the audio. But in relationship to this overall perspective, how should your organization prepare its personnel to act well in an emergency? Is what you see here a good model? And do you have examples, or do you have a different model or no model? And what this arose from my very happy opportunity to talk with Greg and Rick and a few other people over the course of several months as we developed this webinar. And it seemed to me that the general message is this, that an organization needs to conduct risk analysis about the emergency situations that can arise, and some would be typical. For instance, any organization that serves the public, well, even if you yourselves aren't doing something that irritates somebody, there could be people who don't like each other who happen to find themselves in your premises, and then something starts happening. So so unlike policing, where there's very typically fraught situations, it could be just serving coffee and find yourself with people getting hostile towards each other. Secondly, develop operating procedures as to what you expect, procedures or guidelines, mandatory procedures and guidelines for discretionary situations that fit your mandate, whether it's serving coffee or policing. And your culture, is it a culture which respects the dignity of every individual? Third, train the personnel to the point that they can make rapid decisions in emergencies that fit the situation and are true to the organization. You want everybody to have muscle memory and the right muscles, not the wrong muscles about it's my job to win every encounter, but rather the right one of I'm here not to swerve and neglect, but to serve and protect, or whatever it happens to be. And finally, think about those factors that might dissuade personnel or prevent them from behaving in the desired fashion, whether it's the sorts of scrutiny that dampens the enthusiasm of people to do the right thing, whether it's a perception that senior management is actually not going to be holding one's back. So I'd be curious about whether this makes sense to you and whether you have any commentary. And I'm looking on my little control screen here. None of you have raised your hand, and I'm looking on my questions pane, and nobody's added any. Oh dear. Okay. Merci beaucoup, madame. Bonne journée. Somebody just left. Okay, well, I'll keep looking here and then return to some of the other questions. Or actually, Rick and Greg, do you want to comment on that model? Would that be sort of part of your generalized advice to other organizations?
Well, I'm a great, but my thing is culture. Everybody says it's the economy, stupid. No, it's always culture. It's not a few bad apples and we got them, okay? It's not we leverage our leadership, which happens to be the failed leadership that got you into the problem in the first place. You have to have a critical examination of your culture. And if I can just use a quick example, which is neither police nor military, but healthcare professionals. So it came to my realization that only recently surgeons and operating theaters decided it'd be a good idea to use a checklist. Now, are you kidding me? Who can fly an airplane with a checklist? But apparently this was a novel idea. And right up to what, the 21st century, there's some sort of elitist stovepipe orchestration within an operating theater that put the surgeon as the elite. And that's it. You didn't say squat. I mean, you didn't say, where's that sponge? You didn't do any of these things. So all of a sudden, somebody said, wouldn't this be a good idea? And yes, it is. My point being, though, that in line with the modeling that you show there, you want your organization to literally be a learning organization. I don't say in a trite manner, but literally a learning organization. So you're constantly in a position of renewal. The police forces must be in a constant position of renewal. Military forces must do that. And the amazing little checklist innovation for a surgeon here, amazing, truth to power, wow. Putting patients at risk. And I don't have the statistics, but I believe that they're really quite remarkable that we're not, putting off the wrong leg and not having the wrong patient and all these incredible things. I think it's been somewhat revolutionary in hospitals, this entire concept of removing patient risk by having everyone in the team being responsible, not a bystander, not a blind eye. Everyone's a stakeholder in the patient's well-being. If you want a learning organization, then you must be proactively looking at ways to renew, because any organization that is, for whatever reason, not growing internally, culturally, ethically, is already sliding. Okay, so you're not, bad metaphor, the shark. You've got to keep going, or you will definitely not renew, and you cannot be a legitimate learning organization.
Yeah. Okay, a few other comments, and then we'll have to close. It's already 1:30. Oh, it's past 1:30. One comment saying basically that it's highly unlikely that this training is going to work if there isn't trust within the organization. Another comment from the same individual, I'm just summarizing here and translating at the same time, that in general, organizations provide the training at the middle and senior levels, but the front line gets rules and codes of conduct. And that's perhaps why it's hard to get things to get to the front lines. And what one needs really is overall a consistency in the organization to change its culture, its environment, the organization has to reward the behaviors that it wants. For example, being explicit about the goals and and the pay structure and promotions reflecting the organizational desire. And let me ask a last question in that context. Is there generally a problem of the sort of the band of brothers versus the professional? If I, as an individual, want to use my intellectual and ethically honed initiative to do something that's not completely typical, but then I worry that I'll be showing off my buddies and that so forth, and that's a phenomenon that's been studied since the 1930s in the sociology of the workplace, the tall poppy syndrome, the so forth. And is that the case, and is it? And how does one address it? Do you want to do some more than just nod there, Greg?
Yeah.
Can you do?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, my discipline is sociology, and so I completely concur with Rick. This is all about culture. It's critical to demonstrate consistency from leadership all the way to the front lines. I mean, I can't say it sort of more concisely than that, but the key here is to have consistency the whole way down the organization. If you have a problematic culture, you have to figure out a way to change that culture. And the way, in my respectful opinion, is to model the cultural transformation that you want and to encourage that transformation. And if you have positive behaviors taking place at a subcultural level, you have to reward those to encourage others. So obviously, I can't contest my own research findings, and my research findings in the field of policing clearly indicate that the culture is embracing this ethos of depolicing. And so if you want the culture to resist the pull to depolicing, you want to be able to counterbalance those advocates of depolicing in the subcultural context. You have to figure out a way to present an option that's palatable to the individual officer and allow them to resist that temptation, because the police subculture, probably very similar to the subculture of the organizations the people listening are from, the most militant group are the ones that have the loudest voice. And so if you have a subculture where the loudest voice you hear is, stop doing that, we do depolicing, you're making us look bad, stop doing those kind of discretionary engagements, then that's going to be transmitted. So if you want to intercede and change that, you have to have a demonstrable mechanism to counterbalance that and defeat that.
Okay, huge issue. If we do nothing else but look at career patterns, because career patterns, people get promoted, this is how they get the reward and recognition, it's how they get more money, it's more power, whatever it is in human nature that drives us forward to aspire, to rise up in the organization, these are all healthy things. If an organization chooses to have a meritocracy, a genuine, demonstrable meritocracy, reward, recognize, based on its ethos, and it's clear, it's transparent, and everybody's got it. The person to be promoted is that competent person who personifies the ethos, gets promoted, okay? It's competition, which actually pleases everybody. There will always be greater and lesser persons than yourself. The point is, it was fair. He's smarter than I am, he's more able than I am, and so on. But what it also does is drive everybody else to be like the guy that was promoted. So it moves the entire organization upward and forward. The tragedy is if you profess a meritocracy, but everybody knows that's false, that it's absolutely a nepotistic, oligarchic organization where the fix is already in, and none of those positive things take place. So in fact, the people being promoted are not those people that personify the ethos, and they're the ones not selling the ethos. Okay, they're the ones you know, doing tick-in-the-box leadership training and advancing, but never talking to the troops, right? So this is the tragedy of the thing. And that's why I meant, what I meant when you look at the culture and you do an assessment, and it works in all assessments, it's huge. What if you realize that, you know, you're not a meritocracy at all? And I don't want to elaborate on, but, you know, what if in a corporate sense, and remember, everybody knows. Okay, you can profess whatever, but at the end of the day, everybody knows.
What's it, yours?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Have we lost? Yeah.
Did you die? Are you,
I don't know. Oh, it may have been, you just simply run out of power. Remember the battery.
uh-oh.
Okay, can you switch over to yours?
Okay, just a second. Thank you very much, everybody. If you're still on, we'll start the AGM in just a moment. And all of the materials, well, before I get into that, thank you very, very much, Greg Brown. Thank you very, very much, Rick Walker. And yes, you're powering up now. That'll help. I really appreciate your contributions to this discussion, and I hope that everybody has found it as fascinating as I have. I'm really glad that I got into this last December or January and had the pleasure of talking numerous times with you, Rick, and more recently with Greg to learn all about this world. And you know what, Matt, can you go to Wanda and ask her whether we're still on? All right, because we lost and then ask her if we can switch to my. Oh, you know what? Okay, stop recording. Yep.